Welcome to this very exciting ARRO Visiting Professor webinar series called Financial Considerations as a Resident and a New Attending. We have Drs. Siavash Jabbari and we have Drs. Michael Milano who are joining us today, and we thank you so much for your time. Just a disclaimer before we begin that Drs. Milano and Jabbari are practicing physicians and not tax, legal, or personal finance experts. The information presented here is for general informational purposes only and not the advice of a qualified financial, tax, or legal professional. So I really do thank you for sharing your experiences and being open with these really important topics. Let's just go ahead and dive into the first question. So what are some good practices about investing money, like buying a house, investing in bonds as a resident and as a new attending? So Dr. Jabbari, you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Yes. Thank you for having us. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for new attendings and residents. There is so many things that can be optimized for at this early part of the career that'll have huge dividends in the future. And so there is a real time value for optimizing some of these issues early on. I think the best advice anybody could have given me, which fortunately I had, was to self-educate. Continuing financial education is for a high income earner or a high income professional is just as important as continuing medical education. That's just the reality of where we live. So, either self-education, which has to be relatively robust and continuous, and or getting really good professional advice from a trusted source at a fair price. Those two things are paramount. There's plenty of resources out there for self-education. It's much harder to get good advice. I think one of the important things to keep in mind when speaking to an expert, especially in the financial management or tax management sort of realm, is to make sure that person has a fiduciary designation in writing, which is actually a legal term, which means they put your interest ahead of theirs. And so they act truly as an advocate for you as opposed to a salesperson masquerading as an advisor. And also keeping fees in mind are important. I'm a big fan of hourly fees or annual fees and not something like assets under management fees, which can be really exuberant and really take a big hit out of your returns. I think that another important piece of this is to have a general strategy, ideally written down in terms of how you or your spouse want to live your financial lives and how to plan the next 2 years and the next 5 years and the next 10 years. I think having a plan in place that you've talked about and thought about and ideally written down really helps you stick to it. And especially when there's emotional financial situations that come up, for example, upturns or downturns in the market or whatever it may be, having that plan in place kind of helps keep you steady on your course and not make a mistake based on emotion. Dr. Milano, what do you think?
Well, you covered a lot. I think the challenge is a lot of the financial decisions anyone makes is certainly dependent on their given situation, and general advice is sometimes may or may not apply. But in terms of what to consider as a resident, I think you asked about buying a house, and that's a lot goes into that equation. Do you plan on potentially getting a job in that location and maybe having a house longer than residency? And if not, what is the market like in that location? And I think the other question to ask in terms of buying a house is how much work and effort goes into owning something. If you own a townhouse versus a house versus a condominium, they have different responsibilities and different costs associated with it. But I think it's certainly worthwhile for a resident, if they can afford to do so, to look into buying a house. And it depends on the situation. If they have a spouse or a partner, or if they have dependents or children, that may go into the equation in terms of buying a house. So for me, during residency, when I first started, I had an apartment, and then my wife and I eventually bought a condominium. This was before the big housing bust, so it was very easy to get a loan. They were handing out money left and right, and the market was going up, so it made sense for us at that time. In terms of our current residents in upstate New York, it's a different market. The housing doesn't tend to really go up much in value. Recently, it has. So if you were to buy a house in this type of market where there's not a lot of the market doesn't increase in terms of the value of houses, a resident may put in a lot of money in terms of maintaining the house. So that also needs to be considered. So it's not an easy answer in terms of whether residents should buy a house or not. In terms of other investments, I think Dr. Jabbari brought up the point that it's very important to start investing because you will be a high earner as an attending, and start those investing practices early, whether it's bonds or stocks or mutual funds, and looking into what the cost of those are. For mutual funds, some are front loaded, meaning that there's cost up front. But if you buy through a large corporation like Vanguard or TIA, you're less likely to encounter that. So those are other things to look at. So know what you're investing in, I think, is important. And if you don't know, pretty much a large financial bond or bond fund or a stock market fund would be certainly reasonable to consider doing as a resident.
Yeah, so you guys have both brought up really great points. In medical school and residency, we're so busy, and it's hard to find time to educate ourselves on the things you both mentioned. Are there any resources that are good for physicians that you recommend, or anything that you did yourselves to educate yourselves about investments in bonds and stocks?
Dr. Jabbari will say the same thing I would say, and that's the White Coat Investor is a great resource. He has published a book. He's online and on Twitter and has a blog. There's a lot of information. If you search through a Google search, obviously pay attention to what you're reading. But I think it's difficult to ask your fellow co-residents. I know our other co-residents have helped each other out. One of our residents who just graduated was taking his retirement account and just letting it sit there. Another resident basically said, no, you have to actually put it into a fund. So those types of things. So I think it's worthwhile to ask people that are in a similar situation as you. If you get help from a financial advisor, know what you're paying for. A lot of financial advisors are salespeople, and that's perfectly fine. If you know that going in. My financial advisor is primarily a salesperson, and I know that. Or others will charge you a fixed rate, and those individuals, their goal is to educate you, tell you what you should invest your money in, but they're not asking you to necessarily invest your money with them. They're just giving you advice, and you're paying for that advice.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add to Dr. Milano's excellent synopsis is that plenty of people have gotten very comfortable and wealthy without ever investing in real estate. I think, folks who are coming out of residency, most likely their entire adult memory is a perpetual bull market in the real estate arena. And so understandably, they might get the impression that real estate and housing just appreciates and appreciates and appreciates, and the trees grow to the sky and never stop growing. And that's certainly not the case. As Dr. Milano alluded, we're old enough to remember a huge busting crash, and there was been plenty of that before that. So, I think in terms of one's primary residence, you really want to think about your primary residence as a consumer item, as an expense, not as an investment. It's just not. Now, you may get lucky if you hold it long enough, if professionally and personally your life is stable and you hang on to it for a few years and you happen to ride a market up, fine. But it's just as likely as that market may take a big downturn. And so, I really, in my mind, would separate the idea of investment in real estate versus your primary residence. Those are really two different things. And you never have to feel guilty about not doing real estate investing or crypto investing or any of those things. I think you can do just as well with very easy, passive, low cost, well-diversified index funds that have low management fees. And there's actually very good data. There's actual academic, Nobel laureate level data that says that kind of passive, low cost, low effort investing ultimately statistically comes out ahead than all this other passive maneuvering that's quite expensive and time consuming.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate those comments. So we can move on to the next question then. This is something we think about a lot in medicine, but as residents, we don't talk so much about. So I'm really interested in hearing both of your thoughts on how residents and you attending should think about insurance, like malpractice insurance, disability insurance, life insurance, and how expensive are these insurances?
So I can speak to that a little bit in terms of generalities. You know, the main principle is you want to insure against things that, God forbid, if they happen, they can be catastrophic from a financial perspective. And you don't necessarily have to do that for things that you could self-insure. So, for example, you buy an iPhone. The worst thing that'll happen is you're out the cost of that iPhone. That's not going to change your long-term financial health. God forbid you get in a car wreck and somebody sues you. That can be life-changing. And so, you know, number one, every single person listening to this webinar needs to have good umbrella liability insurance. If you don't have that, look that up and get it tomorrow. It's one of the cheapest kinds of insurance that you can get, and it is one of the most important. If you drive, if you own a home, if you entertain, if you live in the US, your risk of personal liability, getting sued for X, Y, and Z reason, is exponentially higher than any risk of professional liability. That's just a statistical fact. So umbrella liability insurance for anyone who has a decent earning or decent potential earnings in the future, because your wages can be garnished, is important. The other things, as you know, someone who's young, early on in their career, is disability insurance. Probably your most valuable asset, unless you were, you know, born with a huge inheritance. Your most valuable asset is your future earning potential, and so you want to protect that in case of disability. And there are a lot of issues with that. The main issue is that there's only a few reputable companies that can provide proper disability insurance for a physician. These have to be quote unquote own occupation policies, which means if you're disabled as a radiation oncologist, you get paid. They can't come back and say, well, you can flip burgers in McDonald's, or you can practice as a, you know, primary care doc or in urgent care, and so we're not going to pay you. So those policies have to be bought through a qualified licensed disability broker who will shop around for you and will do a good job.
And Dr. Jabbari, how expensive is the umbrella liability insurance?
That's a really good question. So umbrella liability is extremely cheap, relatively speaking. It depends on the coverage that you want to get. I would recommend minimum of $1 million. You can go up to $5 million, depending on how quote unquote risky and litigious your area is, your lifestyle, your assets, and so on. A few $100s a year. Disability insurance it is much cheaper when you buy it younger, and when you buy it when you have low income, which is end of residency, or ideally even beginning of residency. Even the first year of attending years can be okay. But as you age and as your income goes up, disability insurance goes up dramatically in terms of cost. So the sooner the better for both of those things.
What do you think, Dr. Milano?
Yeah, these are great pieces of advice. I guess I would add for life insurance, you know, the only need for life insurance is if you die, someone would lose your financial resources that they're depending on. And that could be a partner, a spouse, children, siblings. If you don't have that and don't anticipate having that, you don't need life insurance. If you have a partner or spouse who makes abundant income that they wouldn't necessarily rely on yours, then perhaps you don't need life insurance. If you don't need it now, you do want to question whether you need it in the future. And if that's the case, you might consider doing it when you're younger. And the reason for that is, just like disability insurance, when you're younger, life insurance is cheaper. The other potential advantage of that is if you develop a condition that's potentially life-threatening, even if it's potentially life-threatening decades from now, you may not be insurable. But if you've had that policy in place, then you don't have to worry about your pre-existing condition that you might get. But again, that was only relevant if you anticipate having children, partner, spouse down the road who would depend on your income if you were to pass away. For disability insurance, I can't really add much more to what Dr. Jabbari said. I actually got my first policy when I was an intern, and I've kept that policy. I still have it. And over the years, I've added new policies on. And most of the policies that you would get through your workplace are the type of policy where if you get disabled and you can do another job, you would be expected to do that job. So my disability insurance is through my financial advisor, who, as I mentioned, is a salesman, but what he was selling was something that I felt like I would benefit from, and that's disability insurance that allows me to get disability coverage if I can't do my job, as opposed to if I can't do any job. And that's something to look into. In terms of malpractice insurance, I think most physicians, myself included, are a hospital employed and our insurance is through them. And I wouldn't necessarily feel the need to get my own. The umbrella policy that Dr. Jabbari is talking about, very rarely would you need that for malpractice, but you do need that for home, auto, just living life. Someone slips on your sidewalk and cracks their skull. You had no control over that, but you can get sued for that. And if it exceeds your homeowner's policy, the umbrella policy would take over. So that's the advantage of having an umbrella policy.
Well, you've heard it here from Doctors Milano and Jabbari for their doctors listening to this to consider strongly umbrella liability insurance and disability and life insurance too, as we're younger. Of course, that's a generality, but the younger you are, you might get a cheaper policy, it sounds like. And I know I did some reading on disability insurance, and what I read was the #1 cause of disability in the United States is depression. And I wonder if that's true too in medicine. I mean, I can understand it to be true with everything that we deal with as doctors. So just a reminder for all of us to take care of ourselves and to see our doctors and just to do all that we can to take care of ourselves. So next
That's
question.
A really good point, Abhishek. If I could just add two quick points, just because you brought it up, and it's also pertinent. Most own occupation policies, especially for physicians, at least as far as I'm aware, are probably going to have a mental health exclusion as a blanket, exactly because of what you said, because burnout and mental health, disability can be pervasive. And so those companies are smart. They exclude that. So take care of yourselves, especially, be mindful of burnout issues and taking care of your health. The second thing is most people listening to this webinar probably already have disability insurance through whoever's paying their paycheck, whether it's a educational program, a university, or a private practice setting. Most employers, usually because of state law, provide a small amount of disability insurance. It is not enough to sustain a physician's lifestyle and your family's needs. Almost always high-earning professionals or any middle-class person even probably should have their own separate additional disability insurance that's own occupation. So keep that in mind as well.
Wow, that's a very interesting point about the mental health. Very disappointing, but thanks for telling us about that. I had no idea. This is why we have you on the webinar. So let's move on to the next question. This is a tough question. How do you reconcile saving money versus paying off debt? Some of us have been in school for a very long time. Some of us have not ever had a higher paying job. We've incurred debt. When we become new attendings and we start getting, larger paychecks, how would you reconcile this?
I guess I'll start. In terms of saving money, I think there's probably certain buckets of saving money that I would prioritize over others. I think retirement is one of those because it's a tax deferred savings. As opposed to just investing in the stock market or kind of using a account that's not tax advantage. I wouldn't necessarily prioritize that over paying debt, particularly if the debt is high interest. It is tough to balance that, and I think one advantage of prioritizing putting money in retirement is it forces you to live at a lower income because that money is taken out of your paycheck usually. And if you're hospital employed, that's generally how it works. Certainly, you can do your own retirement account. In paying off debt, the rule of thumb is to pay off the higher interest debt first, and that would include credit card debt. And if you have credit card debt, that it's tough to judge whether or not you should be paying that off versus putting money in retirement. And I think coming up with, I think one of the first things Dr. Jabbari said was have a plan. I think that has to be part of the plan, is how to pay off this high interest debt. In terms of student loans, they're generally not very low interest, but they're kind of in the middle, but you have the ability to space that out over time, and that may be something that you choose to do based on your financial situation. But I think prioritizing retirement and other tax advantage savings would be my recommendation.
I agree with that completely. I think that there's really two ways to optimize for this problem. First of all, there's some things right off the top you got to account for. Obviously, cash flow needs for your household. You know, again, according to your written plan and your budget, what's essential, what's discretionary, what's in between. And so figure out your cash flow and see how much is left. And then everybody should have a rainy day fund or an emergency fund / opportunity fund. And the amount of that depends on a number of factors. But, you know, the usual general advice is something like 3 to 6 months of salary saved up in cash, maybe in a high yield savings account that's FDIC insured. The rest, the question is, you put it towards paying down debt or investing. And, you know, as I said, two ways to optimize it for this. The easy part is to optimize mathematically. What pays higher interest? And what's the opportunity cost for that interest rate you're paying on your debt? And, you know, it's a numerical mathematical problem. So obviously high interest loans should be addressed first. As Dr. Milano said, credit card companies, oftentimes car loans, God forbid if you have any other, you know, third-party loans or anything like that, especially in this kind of current inflationary environment. If you have adjustable rate loans where the rate can go up and it's pegged to the treasury rate, you might want to think about paying those off early, because rates may keep going up in the future. Who knows? And then, you know, fixed low interest loans that tend to be either home loans and or potentially federally subsidized student loans, those take the bottom. So that mathematical optimization is one way to do it. Where do you make more interest rate money? And remember, the interest rate you pay on debt is essentially the exact interest rate that you earn on investments. It's just the negative interest rate. So think about it that way. But the reality is, we're not computers, we're human beings, and behavioral and emotional issues often trump our logical mathematical mind. And so somebody might say out there, and this happens every single day, that, well, I'm not going to pay off this debt because I'm going to earn more in the market or maybe in a bond account. And so that makes more mathematical sense. But the truth is that Christmas comes along, and that birthday party comes along, that vacation comes along, and that luxury item, that car, that brand new attending, you know, Tesla comes along, and all of a sudden you didn't pay down that debt, but you also forgot to invest. And so this goes back to really having a plan in place and having discipline. And it's okay if you don't. If you feel like you and your family may not have that kind of discipline, then pay off the debt. And ultimately, debt will work out better for you as opposed to not paying off the debt and not investing.
Really great points, Doctors Milano and Jabbari. Thank you so much. Let's go on to the next question. This is something we all talk about a lot as residents, especially for tonight's actually graduation night for my PGY5 residents. They've been talking about the tax implications of their bonus and of their new attending salary. Can you comment a little bit about that? Maybe we could start with Dr. Milano.
So my perspective certainly is from an employed physician's perspective. So if you're self-employed, it's a totally different ballgame in terms of what you can do. As a hospital employee, I pay more taxes than somebody that makes less than me, and that's the simple answer. The one thing to understand is that the taxes are in brackets. So whether you make 40,000 or 4 million, the first X amount of dollars that you make is taxed at a certain rate, and as your income goes it gets larger, the next bucket gets taxed at a higher rate, the next bucket gets taxed at a higher rate. The reason why I bring this up is some people say, well, if I made maybe $1,000 less, I'd be paying much less taxes if I just hit that bucket correctly. And that's not the case, because you're basically just being taxed on incremental amount above the bucket. And the buckets change from year to year depending on the tax laws at the given time, and depending on who the president, who's in Congress, those taxes change. There's also state taxes depending on which state you live in. And I live in New York State, which is a pretty highly taxed state. And if you live in New York State and also live in New York City or Yonkers, there's city taxes, which fortunately I don't have to deal with. So those are things to understand, that probably anywhere from a third to a half of your income is going to be taxed. So you just have to know that when you come up with your financial plan about how much money is going to come out. If you do your own investing, you sell stocks and bonds, if you and you do a heavy trading, and one thing to know is that you would need to pay taxes on that as well. And those taxes don't come out up front. So if you don't plan for that, just say you short sell a stock and you make a lot of money, and then you do the same thing a few months later, and it happens to be you did that in December, and a few months later is in February, March, and you lose a ton of money, you need to pay taxes on that money that you gained in the previous year. So you have to understand that there's a time frame when taxes are calculated, and in knowing that. And if you do this a lot and you make a lot of money, I'm not one of the people that do this. I tend to be one of the people that kind of lets it ride. But if you're the type of person that does this, you have to know that you should prepay taxes too. Otherwise, you're going to be charged a tax penalty for not paying your taxes on time. So those are things to be aware of. But taxes are what they are. You just have to know that you're going to be paying them, and to plan around them.
I imagine that with your attending salary plus investments you have, and maybe depending on whether or not I guess the frequency in which you're making investments, that the taxes can get pretty complicated. Do you feel like attendings often have an accountant that helps, or
I think
it kind of varies person to person?
I personally don't. I've used TurboTax since I was in medical school, and I find it pretty easy to use. And it does walk you through all of the investment things. And you get forms from, if you've invested in Vanguard or E-Trade, you get the tax forms, and now they're imported directly into the software. If you're self-employed, then I would get an accountant because it's much more complicated. But again, it's a personal decision. And accountants may wind up paying for themselves if you were to make a mistake. I don't know if Dr. Jabbari has different thoughts on that. I guess I never asked him or talked to him about that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dr. Milano. I think that, especially early on as a resident, when your income is relatively small and it's relatively straightforward on a W-2, your tax implications are relatively minimal. I think most folks can do it themselves, and maybe not even have much of a tax bill at all, if any. And then as things progress, your life gets complicated, your job and career gets complicated, retirement plans get complicated, the dollar amounts go up, which inherently complicates things. Then I think there's more and more value in a certified professional tax preparer, which is very different than a financial advisor or investment advisor or a tax advisor. These are all different things. And so I personally use a tax preparer, but you still have to know a lot about what's under the hood and sort of manage the manager and catch their mistakes. And it happens relatively frequently that they make mistakes, you make mistakes, and you work together to solve the problem. But I think the salient point, as Dr. Milano alluded to, is what a sage philosopher said a few years ago. The notorious BIG said, "More money, more problems," and it's really true. And the number one expense for any physician, number one expense, is taxes, as Dr. Milano said. And that is what moves the needle by far more than anything else. So if you make mistakes on your taxes or your investments, on your taxes and or your retirement accounts, you're never going to make that up in any kind of a magical, genius investing. Taxes make the biggest difference, and the best way to save on taxes is to maximize the retirement accounts that are available to you. Unfortunately, our tax code is not a simple one, and it's really made to favor folks with more information and more sophistication, especially as we get into the higher income years. And so there are ways to really maximize your retirement accounts and minimize your tax liabilities legally. And that can really move the needle. And so that's part of the reason why, even if you have advisors and so on, knowing a bit about it yourself really can help a lot. One general rule of thumb, in addition to maximizing retirement accounts that are available to you and having the discipline to put that money away, is that when you're in your lower income years, residency, maybe that first year of attending year out of residency, it makes most sense for most people to put away post-tax dollars. Another term for that is a Roth contribution. The reason for that is your income is low, and so your effective and marginal tax rates are low. And so you're going to pay a lower tax rate, but you get to, by making post-tax contributions, you essentially get to put away more money, and essentially at the end, and that money gets to grow tax-free. And when you take it out, you pay taxes on it, but you don't pay taxes on it, and you have more growth. In your higher income tax years, because your tax rate is much higher because of your higher income, it makes more sense for most people to put money away pre-tax, so defer taxes. And that's the usual kind of a 401k contribution, for example. And so you let that money grow tax deferred, and then you pay taxes on it later when you take it out in retirement, when hopefully your marginal tax rate is lower. So that's a pretty good rule of thumb to keep in mind.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think we have our next question, maybe even our final question. This is something that folks in the resident room talk a lot about. When we go to conferences, residents talk about this too, about a side hustle. And we're just curious to hear about your thoughts on side hustles as an attending, like moonlighting, locums, consulting jobs for different types of companies. Any thoughts on that, and how it also fits in with, a current full-time job as an attending?
I guess I could say I had a couple random chance things happen that wound up being side hustles. A good friend of mine, when he was in college, he went to college for web development and developed a website for mesothelioma. And eventually, the point of that website was to get people who wanted to join the class action lawsuit, and they needed a physician to essentially be part of that website. So I got involved in that. Another friend of mine, it works for a company that develops CME for physicians, and they need physician CME reviewers. So these are not large amounts of income, but it's a little extra money that you can do enjoyable things with. Maybe do that vacation, or I don't have a Tesla, but if you wanted to get a Tesla, that's another option. The one cautionary thing that applies to something I said earlier is that if you don't get your taxes taken out of that money, to prepay the taxes so you don't get a bill from the IRS for late payment of taxes. But there are many opportunities. I mean, if you want to work for some of the insurance companies as an insurance company reviewer, you might that's an opportunity, although you might get blasted on social media for doing that, particularly if you're denying services that people think are reasonable. But that's something that a lot of radiation oncologists are doing. Certainly working for industry, there's a lot of opportunities for that, and some people transition from practicing physicians to doing that full time, whereas others do that as a part-time role. And I don't know the best avenue to get one of those side hustles. It seems like they can be lucrative and great opportunities. I don't have any inroads to that, but that's another opportunity to do that. In terms of moonlighting, there's opportunities to do that, or locums as well. You'd have to do that on your vacation time or after hours. I think a lot of it depends on your financial situation. I don't know that many radiation oncologists that have done that as attending. Certainly some have done that as residents, covering the radiology practice or emergency room. I think that the question is whether or not that supplements your income enough to do it. It's a bigger commitment than doing some of these other side hustles that maybe you can do while watching TV or relaxing at your home. Whereas those types of things, a true commitment, and I think that's something that you would have to decide whether or not that work justifies the extra income that you might get.
I think those are great points. I think the couple of things that I could add are, especially if you're seeing patients in your second job, whether it's locums or moonlighting or whatever. I don't think you can assume that your day job, your regular job's professional liability insurance would cover you. So that's the important thing to keep in mind. That should really be explored. And if your regular job doesn't cover professional liability from arising potentially from your side hustle, that needs to really be addressed. And that might be an issue. Last thing you want to do is, go on a hook for liability for hundreds of thousands of dollars for a side hustle that pays you a few thousand. The second issue is that, most of these side jobs are going to end up being 1099 income, which is the 1099 is basically an IRS form. It's a designation of how you get paid, and it's a self-employment income, as opposed to what most physicians think about as income, which is W-2 income, which is you're employed by someone else, like a university or a practice or hospital or whatnot. And what's interesting in the tax code is that a given individual for a given job can only have one set of retirement plans or one 401k, but that same individual, if they have two jobs, for example, a W-2 job and a 1099 job, they can have two sets of retirement accounts. So they can have a regular 401k sponsored by their, hospital or group practice or university or whatever it is. And then for their self-employment income, for that 1099 income, they could set up a solo 401k at a place like Vanguard or Fidelity. It's very cheap and easy and essentially cost-free, depending on how many bells and whistles you want to add to it. And that can really dramatically increase your tax protected dollars that you can put away for the future, and really increase the bang for the buck for those dollars that you make as for your side hustle. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
That's a really interesting thought, Dr. Jabbari, and I appreciate what you also said, Dr. Milano. I mean, how feasible is it to have a side hustle? If I imagine as a new attending, you're probably just trying to learn how to be an attending, but over time, as you become more accustomed to practice, do you know a lot of radiation oncologists who are having side hustles, or is it something that's not talked about too much?
I would remind people of the 80-20 rule. If you went into radiation oncology to practice radiation oncology and see patients, and you're happy with that, and that's paying the bills and keeping you happy, I think chances are you'll get the most professional benefit and enjoyment, and personal benefit and enjoyment, and financial gain by just sticking to what you know best and what you've been trained for and what you want to do, if that's indeed what you want to do. Now, if you have some time on the side, you want to do something else, fine. But I think sometimes sort of stepping over $1 to save a penny or to make a penny can be a little bit counterproductive, in my perspective on it.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. If a side hustle is relatively low stress and easy to do, and it's what's worthwhile, I think if it requires a large commitment of time, you're going to be juggling that between your regular job, and you don't want your regular job to be compromised in any respect, because that's what you've spent 4 years of medical school and 5 years of residency to do, and that should definitely be your priority.
That makes total sense, and I agree with that too. The main reason why we became radiation oncologists for many of us is to see patients, and you don't want to burn out doing something else. Well, I appreciate all of that. These are all the questions we had, but we have some extra time, and I was wondering if we could just maybe hone in on a little bit more of the resources that we were talking about before, that maybe residents or new attendings can read. I know the White Coat Investor is a really great one, and one we've heard a lot about. Any other resources that are geared towards physicians, or even not, that you would recommend? Any podcasts that we can listen to on our way to clinic that you recommend for us to learn about the topics discussed today?
I mean, there's a lot. There's another one that's Physician on Fire, and his primary interest is educating physicians on how to retire early. But even if you have no plans to retire early, so FIRE stands for financially independent, retiring early. Even if that's not your plan, the advice that he gives is excellent in terms of how to invest your money and keep it safe. And I think that's a principle, whether or not your goals are aligned with whoever you choose to listen to. White Coat Investor is more of a general how do you invest is when you're a physician and try to do it again in a safe, low cost manner. Dr. Jabbari mentioned very early, you want to invest in funds or investments that don't have a lot of costs associated with them, because that's throwing money away.
I agree. There's also, a long-running forum called the Bogle has, who's named after Jack Bogle, who first came up with the idea of low-cost index funds and founded Vanguard based on that. That's a good forum with a lot of general information and investing information, specifically with that kind of a philosophy in mind in terms of, the sort of a Jack Bogle low-cost index fund investing and everything that goes into that. By the way, I do want to say neither Dr. Milano or I have any kind of a financial or any other relationship with any of these folks that we're mentioning. These forums are not the Bogle has, but the White Corner Professor and Physician on Fire, from my understanding, are for profit. They make money, but they do it based on advertising. And in my experience, they give good, fair advice that's generally evidence-based as much as it can be. There's plenty of financial books out there too, and publications, and if you want to get into the weeds, there's academic papers on a lot of these topics as well that are written by academics, by true academics. So the resources are not a limitation. Just pick one and learn everything you can from there, and that's plenty.
I think there was a paper with a white coat investor and Trevor Royce, who's a radiation oncologist, that gives some helpful advice as well. So as Dr. Jabbari mentioned, there's a lot of information out there that you can delve into.
Was that paper geared towards rad-oncs, or was it just Dr. Royce happened to be rad-onc on the paper? Okay. Well, that's awesome. I'll definitely look into that. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Jabbari and Dr. Milano. I know you're both very busy and you have, clinic and families and all that. So I appreciate you making this time for residents. The whole point of this seminar series is to go through topics that are not really well covered in our traditional residencies. And I think this is a huge topic that's often undercovered. So I really, really do appreciate it. And so do all the residents. I think we'll wrap up then. So you have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you for asking me to do.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.